This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Hello there, welcome to this edition of Global Business Africa. In the next hour, we're going to run through all the business news stories you need to know about from the continent and beyond. But first, a quick run through the markets for you. So some fairly strong numbers from some of the bourses that we do track here on the program. But let's focus on Kenya specifically. The central bank has mandated pricing changes for mobile money transactions. That includes stopping banks from charging for transfers of cash between mobile money wallets and bank accounts. Expect a bit of a hit to non-funded income from that particular directive. Emergency measures imposed in response to the pandemic did push the monthly volume of peer-to-peer transactions up by nearly 90% between February and the month of October. Safaricom shares closed about 0.3% higher today. The top two banks by assets, though, responded rather differently. KCB and Equity, they closed 0.14% higher and down nearly 2% on Equity Bank. Here's what's coming up tonight. Nigeria starts a phased reopening of its borders after a year-long closure, ostensibly to curb smuggling. Kenya's largest banks continue to increase their market share. And Bitcoin is setting another all-time high. We'll look at the latest surge when we come back. But our starting point tonight is in West Africa, where Nigeria, the largest economy in the region and the continent as a whole, has finally decided to reopen at least 4 border crossing points on land, more than a year after shutting down her land borders. At the time, the excuse was that was needed to stop smuggling. During a Federal Executive Council meeting, the Finance Minister, Zainab Ahmed, confirmed that the border points would be reopened. But she revealed that the government upheld restrictions on rice and poultry importation. Now, Nigeria did shut down its land borders in October last year. At the time, the argument was that this was done in order to curb smuggling, which the government says threatens efforts to boost local production, security and generate tax revenues through import duties. Discussions to reopen Nigeria's borders, however, have been going on for months, with the government insisting on levying duties on goods transiting through the country to neighbouring nations in order to put an end to smuggling. So what exactly does this policy change mean, though, for importers and households in Africa's largest economy? Let's find out. Muda Yusuf is the Director General of the Lagos Chamber of Commerce. He joins us now from that very city tonight. Mr. Yusuf, thank you for your time this evening. So the federal government deciding to reopen 4 border points now, but restrictions on the importation of rice and some other products still remain. Why?
Well, the government has a commitment to promote self-reliance in agriculture, particularly in the area of food, because investors in the agricultural sector have reported that they benefited from the closure of the land border. For example, the rice farmers have commended the closure, the poultry farmers have commended the closure, the vegetable oil producers have also commended the closure. So there are quite a number of stakeholders that felt that it was a good thing to have closed the border. I think that is perhaps why the government has insisted that importation of rice, poultry products, and some agricultural products should remain prohibited from importation. The whole idea is to grow the agricultural sector and make the country self-reliant in food.
But surely if that was the case, I mean, this is something that could have been accomplished by simply imposing tariffs on those specific items, as opposed to simply shutting the land border and saying, no, you can't move in any goods through the land border into and out of Nigeria.
Well, I think it's an indication of the confidence that the government has in the tariff policy process. I've had arguments in government about the fact that using tariff to protect industries has not been quite effective. I think that is why the government has decided to opt for total prohibition. And we have quite a number of lists like that in the tariff book, and we have quite a long list as well that the central bank also has. We have what you call the foreign exchange exclusion list, quite a long list of products that are not eligible to access the foreign exchange market on account of wanting to protect domestic industries and the domestic farmers. So the whole idea is the protectionist disposition that the government has. But whether that has been yielding the desired results is a different matter. Because even with that, we have serious issues with productivity. We have serious issues with supply and all of that. So we are grappling with a huge gap between the demand and supply. And these are part of the things that have been fueling the smuggling of food items and some other products.
Right. So given this change in policy, though, it's reasonable to expect that food inflation will continue to keep rising because, among other things, the factors that you've just pointed out, the massive gap between demand and supply.
Well, it is not likely. But you see, even with the closure of the border, we have reports that smuggling was still going on. You know, possibly not at the scale that it was before the closure of the border. Because the land borders in Nigeria is quite wide and is quite porous. So there is also a limit to the capacity of the government agencies to be able to police the border effectively. And for as long as there's a huge demand and supply gap, for as long as the capacity to produce locally is limited, for as long as the cost of production and the cost of operation of many of our industries and agro-allied industries are high, there will always be this disparity in price. And for as long as you have this disparity in price, we will always face the challenge of smuggling.
Right. One last question for you, sir. The federal government is still pretty insistent on imposing duties on goods in transit to her neighbours, like Benin, for example, as part of efforts to curb the smuggling. But how exactly will that work in practice? But just as important, how does that square with Nigeria starting to trade under CFTA rules in about 2 weeks' time?
Well, I think the government is beginning to change its position and its policy on a few things. I have a feeling that even the decision to open the land borders was partly as a result of the pressure coming from our ratification of the CFTA. So it's part of the pressure, and I'm also aware that even within ECOWAS, there's a lot of pressure to relax some of these conditions. So I believe that any constraint or impediment to the implementation of the Continental Free Trade Agreement will be removed eventually. I think it's an incremental thing. Even the opening of the land borders, only 4 of the major land borders are open now. The rest will be open by the end of the year. So progressively, I think these policies will be relaxed to bring them in alignment with our ratification of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement.
Indeed, we'll see how this plays out. Should be a very interesting story to follow. Muda Yusuf is the Director General there of the Lagos Chamber of Commerce. Thank you. Now, on to South Africa. The government over there has won a court case over public sector wage increases that it has refused to pay. Essentially, this gives it room to repair a massive fiscal deficit and also tackle its soaring public debt loads. Trade unions went to courts to try to enforce a wage deal struck back in 2018 that promised their members inflation-linked wage hikes for 3 consecutive years. Now, the government honoured its deal for the first 2 years, but it did not pay the final year of inflation-linked hikes. The final instalment was due to be paid in April this year at an approximate cost of more than $2.5 billion, which the government says, look, we simply can't afford to pay you this when there's a COVID-19 pandemic. The Labour Appeals Court ruled that it would be unlawful for trade unions to enforce the latest wage increases because it would contravene parts of the Constitution. At the same time, business confidence in South Africa has risen to its highest level in 2 years in the fourth quarter of this year. It's a solid rebound in economic activity ever since a hard lockdown was instituted at the end of March. South Africa is now on level 1, essentially almost the lowest tier of its restrictions, with nearly the entire economy reopened for business. Here's CGTN's Sumitra Naidu with that report.
Business in South Africa slowly getting back on track. Whilst the hard lockdown was necessary, it battered the economy. But according to the latest RMB Business Confidence Index, there's some upside.
I think it was expected that some sectors of business would begin to ramp up, and that's what's happened. But I think we need to appreciate that that ramp up is from a significant drop in the previous quarter. What we've seen in the last quarter is that the opening up of the economy in the last couple of months after going down to lockdown level 1 has had a beneficial impact on economic growth.
All sub-indexes in business confidence rose, albeit off a low base. There are concerns, though, that a second wave of COVID-19 currently sweeping across the country will impact business again.
I think we're certainly probably past the worst because I don't imagine that we would go back to a hard lockdown like we saw at level 5 that crippled many businesses' opportunity to actually operate. I think where we're not past the worst is particularly structurally reconfiguring the economy to be able to grow sustainably. We've got to make sure that we remove those structural impediments.
The president addressed South Africans Monday night announcing tighter restrictions to curb the spread, but was careful not to limit business too much.
We've seen in Europe, as we continue to see in America, the virus hasn't gone away. In fact, the virus is even stronger in the second wave, and we're beginning to see that in South Africa. We have certainly said publicly that we don't think if a move from lockdown level 1 to stronger lockdowns is appropriate. We don't think that's going to actually assist in curbing the growth of and the spread of the virus, and it will have a detrimental impact on the economy.
The Business Confidence Index jumped to 40 from 24. It's a significant rise, but one that comes on the back of eased lockdown regulations. South Africa still has a long way to go before strong economic activity returns and the business environment is more conducive for entrepreneurs. Sumitra Naidu, CGTN, Johannesburg, South Africa.
From one end of the continent to another, annual headline urban inflation in Egypt accelerated for the second month in a row to 5.7% in November. That's the highest level in 5 months. As CGTN's Yasser Hakim now reports, that increase was driven by higher food prices, which single-handedly brought annual inflation to its highest levels since May.
According to Egypt's official statistics agency CAPMAS, inflation has taken an upward trend in the last 2 months after it had dropped below 4% in September, its lowest in years. The increase has been influenced by higher demand on food and basic items, which single-handedly pushed annual inflation to its highest since May. This is as monthly headline figures remain muted at 0.8%.
تحديدا الخضروات زادت بنسبة 25% وإجمالي القسم.
Vegetable prices increased by 25% and tomatoes by 110%, and this led to the total food items to increase by 3.2%. This has pushed inflation up. The central bank has set a target inflation of not more than 9% or below 6% by the end of the year. Therefore, this hike is deliberately planned by the bank.
وفقا لرؤية البنك المركزي والسياسات اللي هو بينتهجها.
The upper ceiling of 9% inflation rate was a prerequisite by the IMF when approving a $5.2 billion emergency one-year loan for Egypt to confront the effects of the coronavirus pandemic. In September, the IMF warned that low inflation is a reflection of a slowdown in the economy and had urged the Central Bank of Egypt to push it up. In response, the CBE cut interest rates by 400 basic points to encourage Egyptians to spend more rather than save their money in banks. Lower interests also helps businessmen borrow to expand their projects or to establish new investments. Though it helps stimulate the market, higher inflation is a double-edged sword.
بشكل أو بآخر طبعا المواطن بيتأثر.
One way or another, the citizen is affected and the economy too. On the economy level, higher inflation means higher prices, which increases expenditures, reduces savings and investments. This in turn affects productivity. As for the citizen, he will be faced with more expensive goods and services.
Going into the new year, most experts believe Cairo will hit the IMF target of 9% in the second half of 2021, up from the current 5.7%. Yes, Hakim for CGTN, Cairo.
Right, then let's make a quick run through some company news for you. Netflix has appointed the Zimbabwean telecoms billionaire Strive Masiyiwa to its board. Masiyiwa is a founder of the Econet Group, which has operations and investments in 29 countries in Africa and beyond the continent. Like other big tech firms, Netflix has been looking to diversify the mix of its board. Netflix has also been expanding its reach across Africa relatively rapidly in the last years. It's rolling out a haul of original African shows and movies. Kenya Airways has announced plans to start direct flights from Nairobi's Jomo Kenyatta International Airport to Hergesa in Somaliland by the end of Q1 2021. In a statement, the two heads of state, that's from Kenya and Somaliland, announced that the direct flight will not only involve KQ but also other Kenyan carriers as well. These plans come barely 5 months after Kenya's low-cost carrier, that's Jambojet, halted plans to launch a direct flight from Nairobi to the Somali capital of Mogadishu. At the time, it cited the high cost of insurance needed to ply the route. The mobile operator MTN says it will give investors greater clarity on a meeting it held with Nigerian telecommunications regulators earlier in the week. The Nigerian Communications Commission, which is conducting an audit of the mobile subscriber database, ordered the country's network operators last week to suspend all sales and activations of new SIM cards. That's a move that had MTN investors worried about the company's prospects in its biggest market. Shares in MTN fell 10% a day after that announcement came to light. And finally, in aviation, the world's largest low-cost carrier, that's Southwest Airlines, has announced plans to take delivery of 35 Boeing 737 MAX aircraft through the end of 2021. According to the carrier, those deliveries include 16 leased aircraft, with expectations of the MAX returning to revenue service in March after all active pilots have received updated training for that particular aircraft. Earlier this month, Boeing bagged its first ever bulk order for the 737 MAX since its grounding back in March 2019. This happened after the Irish budget carrier Ryanair agreed to buy 75 of the planes, adding to the 135 MAX jets it had previously had on order. That's a run through your company headlines. You're watching Global Business Africa. Time for a short break. Here's what's coming up next. Kenya's largest banks keep increasing their market share. We'll look at the latest data. And Ugandan hotels are struggling to get back on their feet, even as authorities ease pandemic restrictions.
The world economy as we know it is about to change. Global business reports highlight emerging markets, developing countries, and dynamic sectors worldwide. We feature top analysts and newsmakers to provide perspectives on every facet of business. From an on-the-ground perspective, we provide you with balanced and objective assessments. Fast, sharp, and insightful. Global Business, only on CGTN.
He is credited with transforming banking in Kenya, from an exclusive service to an accessible and essential service. He says he has the formula and tools to avail financial services to all parts of the African continent.
We have learned the lessons. We know what works. We have the capability to leapfrog on technology.
Tens of awards later, he keeps his eyes on the prize.
We are doing things with an objective that is people-centered.
He built Equity Group from an unknown building society in the 80s to one of Africa's top banks with assets in excess of $8 billion. He's also giving thousands of students the wings to fly.
Education is the only way for all our children.
We speak to Dr. James Mwangi, the man at the helm of the Equity Group. How far can he replicate his success?
Africa is the nexus of enterprise, and global business will tell you why it matters.
From the mega investment projects to multi-billion-dollar mergers and acquisitions.
Africa today collects, just in terms of revenues from taxes alone, $545 billion a year. If you take 10% of that and you devote it to the energy sector, problem solved.
All this on Global Business, weekdays at this time on CGTN.
Welcome back to the program. Let's head over to Kenya to look at the country's banking sector. 9 of Kenya's largest banks increased their market share in the industry to nearly 75% at the end of 2019 from 70.28% in 2018. That's according to the country's central bank's banking supervision report covering 2019. Now, the gain in market share is attributed to the entry of NSE Bank into the top tier ranks. That's following its merger with CBA. The number of medium-sized banks fell to 9 from 10 after that particular merger. Medium-sized banks and small banks, however, did record a decrease in their market share, falling to 17.1% and 8.22% respectively, from 21.22% and 8.5% in December 2018. The number of bank branches in Kenya does continue to fall. 1,490 of them operating last year compared to 1,505 back in 2018. This comes as more and more banks adopted alternative delivery channels. So more Kenyans are going to mobile banking, banking online, and of course agency banking as well. All right then, so let's dig a little deeper into what exactly has happened as far as the cashless payment side of the Kenyan banking sector is concerned, particularly in 2020. Fintech, cashless payments have turned out to be one of the biggest beneficiaries from this particular pandemic. So let's review 2020 and what lies ahead in the next 12 months with Makabelo Malumane. She's the head of transaction banking at Standard Chartered, and she joins us now live on the line. Thank you very much for your time. So the central bank has put out data that indicates there was a nearly 40% decline in card payments between March and April 2020, and transaction volumes only got back to January levels as recently as October. What exactly happened there, and what trends are you seeing since then?
Thank you for having me on your show today. It's actually an interesting dynamic that's starting to play out within the markets, where yes, there has been a decline with the card payments, but what we're starting to see is there's a lot of traction that's coming through with mobile payments. And what that means is obviously as banks and players, financial industry players, we do have to adapt to those changes. The journey has been ongoing for quite a while, but with the COVID-19 pandemic coming through, that has really accelerated how consumer behavior is shifting and where we're starting to see payments happening. One of the trends that we expect to start developing and evolving at a faster pace than they have in the past is just around the whole e-commerce space and just having payments moving on to digital channels rather than the traditional brick and mortar transactions that you would have seen in the past. So I think with that, it really places the financial industry in an interesting space. And it's really time for collaboration with fintechs. It's no longer about just banks dominating. It's about finding those partnerships that work so we can find the right solutions for our clients.
Because that implies a sort of interesting fungibility between mobile payments on one hand and card payments on the other. But given what we've seen so far in this year, in 2020, do you think that shift is essentially now permanent, or has it just accelerated? We're going to be seeing more mobile payments, and cards perhaps might be obsolete, for lack of a better word, maybe in 3-5 years?
Well, the world that we operate in now is evolving at a faster pace than we have before. And yes, the pandemic has accelerated some of the payment journeys that have started in the past. So we expect the disruption to continue. I think it is a bit hard to break habits once they've been formed. We've been in this space essentially for about 9 months now, from around March 2020, where we've really had to change how we operate, even as consumers and banks. So I think with that dynamic coming through, we will start seeing a bit of that dominance. There is also obviously considerations around cybersecurity that one would consider when they're deciding what mode of payment channel they should use. There are elements around cost. We still see a bit of a discrepancy between mobile transaction costs versus what you would see as card payments. So all those will really eventually get to a point where it has to be about our consumers and the customers and it has to be about bringing fairness to the game, and the old days of, you know, leveraging on one who has a monopoly will probably start falling away.
Indeed. Just before I get to the consumer side of things, the other thing with the mobile payment space is that it's really just dominated by one player. M-Pesa accounts for roughly, I believe, 98% of market share as far as transactions are concerned. Given that you're sitting on one end of that transaction chain and M-Pesa is this massive colossus in the middle of it, how do you deal with that concentration risk?
It's an interesting dynamic, and I guess what tends to happen is we're driven by what our consumers or what our corporate clients would want more specifically, right? And they are obviously well aware of the dominance of our mobile wallet providers, and they would look at alternatives. So what you're seeing, I'm sure you've heard about PesaLink in Kenya as an example, which is driving faster payments, right? And as much as it has probably been slightly slow to pick up, we are starting to see a move where they're targeting things like merchant payments, which was not necessarily the available mode of transacting initially. So with those shifts coming through, I think we will get to a point where there is a bit of a level playing field. So as a bank, our stance really is to leverage on the opportunities that come through from various players. So we're not really invested on just doing what traditional banks have done. We do partner with fintechs. We do partner with the mobile wallet operators, the big techs. We're really open to that space. And I think if you can't be open to that type of opportunity, then you will certainly be left behind.
Indeed. Data from the National Bureau of Statistics and the World Bank did point to a fairly sharp rise in some fairly grim data. Unemployment rates did triple in the course of the year, income reduction across a significant part of the population as well. Given how constrained the macroeconomic environment is, are you expecting any above-inflation growth in cashless payments?
It's an interesting one, Ramah Nyang, in this particular space. So we do expect a growth, but I do not think it's necessarily linked to the availability of income to spend. I think it's really just a shift of where transactions are coming from. So traditionally, we've still seen cash being quite dominant, but obviously with the pandemic coming through, we're starting to see that shift now moving towards merchant payments being done online. We're looking at clients who are starting to think about transitioning their business models from the traditional brick and mortar to embracing digital services. Obviously, that comes through with its own challenges, and I think a lot of it is around just knowledge around this particular space, because it is fairly new, especially if you start looking at SMEs who dominate that particular space. So we believe the spend will mostly be obviously on essential goods. I don't think you'll see a hike in the higher end spending that we've traditionally seen, but it will be for necessities. And the shift or the increase that we will see in card payments, in mobile payments, will not necessarily be due to funds being easily available or income being readily available. It will just be a shift in behavior. That said, I mean, I think when we look forward into the horizon into 2023, there is an anticipation that from emerging markets, you should start seeing cashless payments increasing by about 23%. So I think for a market like Kenya, we're clearly well poised for that. And once the economy starts recovering, we should then significantly see the flows rising in that particular space.
Indeed. In about 2 weeks' time, the Kenyan tax agency, KRA, will start implementing a digital services tax rate, 1.5% being levied on the value of transactions being done. Could you clarify what kind of data, if any, KRA has actually sought from payment processors like StanChart as part of efforts to implement this tax? How exactly would it work?
So it's an interesting one when you're looking at this digital services tax. And it's really trying to solve for leveling the playing field when it comes to what would be applicable to a resident versus what would be applicable to a non-resident player in the market that's providing digital services or goods to consumers. I think historically, we've seen that tax has really been limited to particular jurisdictions and how it works in those jurisdictions. But we've also seen that over time, there is a need from an international level to level the playing field. So if you're a player in Kenya and you don't have permanent residence in the country, there are still some tax implications for your operations. And I think this is the start of that. happening. There is a view that it will happen at a bigger level through OECD, but I think some markets, including Kenya, are starting to take the lead and go on that journey. Now, we enjoy a really good relationship with Kenya Revenue Authority in Kenya. We process over 20% of the corporate flows for them. So the journey to get to this point has been a consultative one, where we're working with them to ensure that we do the right thing, which is one of our values in the bank. So the information that we would provide is in line with that. And it's really to enable them to think forward around what are some of the challenges that they could potentially face as this digital services tax gets rolled out, and how can players like Standard Chartered, who are an authorized tax collector in the bank, can actually help. And for us, it also gives us a step further, or takes us a step further with our clients, because we see that there is a trend where e-commerce will be on the rise going forward. It actually puts us in a good position to leverage on some of our propositions, like our straight-to-bank pay proposition, which is an e-commerce platform for clients, across corporate clients across the board. And what we tend to start doing in that space is helping our clients think through how they will comply with some of these regulations that are coming through in the new year.
Indeed, it's going to be a very interesting tax that we're going to see playing out on the 1st of January. Makabelo, thank you very much for your time this evening. She, of course, is the head of transactional banking at Standard Chartered. Now, let's move on to something a little different in Uganda. The hospitality sector over there is struggling to get back on its feet, even as authorities in the country are starting to ease pandemic restrictions. Hotels in the East African nation have lost close to $320 million in estimated revenue since March due to the pandemic. It's also projected that 66% of jobs in the entire industry will be lost by the end of the year. CGTN's Ramah Nyang filed this report from Kampala.
For 3 months, these hotels in Uganda's capital Kampala had no guests. A national lockdown and closure of the airport meant limited operations in the hospitality sector. This isn't the first time businesses in Uganda have had to battle with disease outbreaks.
We will have to make some structural adjustments so as to keep afloat. We're hoping for the best. Our country is very resilient because Uganda has dealt with a lot of issues. HIV/AIDS, we're hit very hard. Ebola, we're hit considerably hard.
According to the Uganda Hotel Owners Association, more than 2,500 staff have been laid off. Hotels have reopened since May, and Uganda's national parks, a key tourist attraction, have been open to international visitors since October. It's provided a lease of life to the hospitality sector, but also a rethink in operations.
We've got to change the way we do business. We've got to change the approaches. It's going to be less of the face-to-face and physical contact kind of business approach. Now maybe use more of social media, use more of the technologies that are around.
Uganda is now turning its focus on promoting more domestic tourism, and many businesses will be banking on the holiday season to partly make up for the deficits. But sector experts still anticipate tough times ahead.
We are going into election year, so for us tourism is still a very long way off. We are seeing all these travel advisories about people not coming to Uganda. Recently, a very big conference that was scheduled to be held in 2021 has been cancelled because of what we are seeing in the press about the elections. And also there's a second wave going on in our source markets in Europe and in America. So I think we're still a couple of months away from recovery.
Uganda receives about 1.8 million tourists annually at its national parks and sites. The tourism ministry says it has lost about $1.6 billion since Uganda's first COVID-19 case was announced in March, while hotels have lost close to $320 million in business. Despite the huge losses, hotels and tourism sites are beginning to see a considerable rise in visitations. The festive season could offer more. However, the persistence of COVID-19 could stall any progress made so far. Ramah Nyang, CGTN, Kampala, Uganda.
You're watching Global Business Africa. Time for another break. Here's what's coming up. Bitcoin's December rally continues as it smashes through $23,000 US. And the UK and the EU are now setting a Sunday deadline to wrap up Brexit trade talks. It's just taken me completely out of my depth, but at the same time it's exciting. It's new, it's different, it's a challenge.
It's really exciting.
Over the last 14 hours of rain.
Welcome back to the program. These are some of the stories making your headlines at this hour. The French head of state Emmanuel Macron is in self-isolation after testing positive for COVID-19. It's still not clear, though, which symptoms he's experiencing or where he could have contracted the disease. The French head of state attended a number of high-profile events in recent days, including an EU summit. Following his diagnosis, several other European leaders, including the Spanish Prime Minister, said they too would self-isolate. A video has emerged showing kidnapped Nigerian boys in a forest. Police searching for them. The video has been allegedly released by the Boko Haram insurgent group. That militiamen had earlier in the week claimed responsibility for the kidnappings in northwestern Nigeria. The 6-minute-long video features young boys speaking English and in Hausa. The United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization is seeking an extra $14 million to help control a nasty locust invasion in the Horn of Africa and Yemen. It says a new generation of desert locust swarms is now threatening agricultural and pastoral livelihoods. This is despite intense efforts to control this pest throughout 2020. And finally, China's head of state Xi Jinping has expressed his congratulations for the success of the Chang'e 5 lunar lander. The probe is now back at the headquarters of the China Aerospace Science and Technology Corporation, where rock and soil samples from the moon, I believe the technical term is regolith, will be offloaded for research. The craft landed earlier this morning in Inner Mongolia. President Xi called it a great step forward for China's space industry. That's a run through your headlines. All right, crypto fans, Bitcoin has hit a new all-time high. In fact, it did hit one yesterday, and it set another one in the last couple of hours. Yesterday, it hit 20,000. Today, it smashed through $23,000. This volatile virtual currency has risen by more than 170% this year amid stock market turmoil. Bitcoin jumped by at least 1.5% yesterday and 10% today, buoyed by demand from large investors who are keen on its potential, apparently, for some profits. There are also expectations it might eventually gain widespread traction as an acceptable method of payment from the likes of Starbucks and Microsoft. But remember, this has been a very bumpy ride for investors in Bitcoin. The cryptocurrency did pass $19,000 in November, then it dropped sharply before recovering. Bitcoin is widely traded, much like real currencies, but it also has growing support as a form of payment, with PayPal being among the most recent adopters of cryptocurrencies. On to Brexit now. Yet another week and another deadline has been set in post-Brexit trade talks, this time by the European Parliament. MEPs say that they want a final on their desks by midnight on Sunday, or they won't have enough time to ratify or reject it by the end of the year. This deadline adds pressure to what is already a fairly complicated and very drawn-out negotiation. CGTN's Tony Waterman filed this report from Brussels.
Members of the European Parliament have issued this ultimatum, concerned that their role in this process is being marginalized. Every day that passes is one day less that they have to read the text, to scrutinize it, debate it, and then vote on it. In any other trade negotiation, this would take around 4 months. Now it is being squeezed into mere days. In a tweet, Manfred Weber, who heads up the biggest political party in Parliament, said MEPs didn't believe that this would still be possible after Sunday, and as the only elected officials in Brussels, they don't want to be seen as rubber stamping what could be the most consequential trade deal for years to come. So MEPs have put a Sunday deadline on receiving the final text, but in the meantime to hand over the draft version so that they can get cracking on what is said to be a 1,000-page long deal. Now, it's unlikely that the Commission will want to do that because it then becomes like too many chefs in the kitchen. MEPs could start pushing back on parts of the deal that aren't finalized yet, or worse, it could leak to the press. This demand, though, coming after the EU's chief negotiator, Michel Barnier, briefed the party presidents on Thursday. In a tweet, he said that good progress has been made, but the last stumbling blocks remained. Fisheries, at this point, we know, is the biggest hurdle still to be cleared. Across the channel, the UK's Michael Gove said negotiators are working around the clock to try and clinch a deal, and that Britain was going the extra mile in talks.
The UK government has been clear about the importance of maintaining sovereignty, the right to diverge, and indeed full control over our waters. And we shan't be ambiguous about that, but we are determined, if we can, to reach a free trade agreement, and our negotiators are working hard to that end.
The deadline set by the EU Parliament piles pressure on what is a pressure cooker situation already. And if they follow through with their threat, it could lead to no deal being in place come January 1st, even if one. Not the best way to start off the new year or a new trade relationship. Tony Waterman, CGTN, Brussels.
Across the Atlantic, the US Central Bank is keeping interest rates unchanged amid growing concern about the pace of a post-pandemic recovery. Interest rates have been pared back to between 0.25%. Those are levels that have not really been used ever since the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis. The Federal Reserve is worried enough to allow inflation to temporarily run above its usual target in order to not impede growth. But distribution of a vaccine in the US has at least provided a much more optimistic, longer-term outlook. Here's CGTN's Owen Fairclough with more.
Jerome Powell's last meeting of a year that's once again turned the Federal Reserve into a financial firefighter.
The outlook for the economy is extraordinarily uncertain and will depend in large part on the course of the virus.
Maintaining interest rates at close to zero and pumping billions into an economy that bounced back somewhat from its COVID-19 crash at the end of the summer, but is now stalling as it heads into a bleak winter of surging infections.
As with overall economic activity, the pace of improvement in the labor market has moderated. Job growth slowed to 245,000 in November, and while the unemployment rate has continued to decline, it remains elevated at 6.7%.
This was also the Fed's last interest rate meeting under President Trump. He chose Powell, but soon tore into him.
He raised interest rates too fast, too furious.
When Trump wanted them permanently low to fire up economic growth. Ironically, Trump got those ultra-low interest rates, even if they were intended to save an economy in freefall as the pandemic overwhelmed the US and, for voters, the president.
You know, I'm not a big fan of the Fed, you know that. I think they make a lot of mistakes.
But if Powell will soon be spared Trump's wrath as president, he may still need to consider his future. President-elect Joe Biden will be free to replace Powell once he takes office next month. Owen Fairclough, CGTN.
Well then, tonight on What's Hot, we dive into the world of art and tech, just perhaps not in the way you expect. We'll take you to the Ming Contemporary Art Museum in Shanghai, where a video game and a digital installation exhibition of Play of Beings is in progress. That exhibit is bringing back some happy childhood memories and in some cases, some horrifying nightmares.
Ever dreamt of an infinite, all-you-can-play arcade with a conglomeration of games from different eras? That's what the exhibition hall includes. 1980s arcade machines, a variety of home computer games, to the incredible graphics and battles of massive multiplayer online role-playing games. Artist Lu Yang has created a video and a game that you can play along a concept she called Digital Incarnation, depicting what it could be like if we died and in the afterlife entered a digital game. A character named Uterus accompanies the hero through heaven and hell, alluding to the fact that whatever path we choose, the universal starting point in life is a womb.
In the infernal level, one is out of their body. You can see time and sizes are distorted because we are no longer bound by them. In the hell level, it makes you think about what constitutes pain. Can you still feel pain if you don't have a body? The answer is yes. In some Eastern literature, there's this form of punishment where one is turned into a stone. The person is stuck there until the stone is destroyed. Think of the infinite loneliness it entails.
Most of the installations are games with a message. With Jeffrey Shaw's piece, step onto a rug and the mankins fall, but each time in a different pattern. Though repetitive, the curator considers this an interpretation of what we pursue in life.
It's a classic Sisyphean tragedy. When we play a game, there are only a limited number of endings, but you still play it, sometimes repetitively, which shows we enjoy the process of getting there, not just the result.
Pick up a payphone painted with graffiti and receive a voice message in dialect, and ponder over school-age loneliness at empty desks and dinner tables. Also, ruminate over one's helplessness by gazing upon a piece that represents a childhood horror. TV static, that means that there's no more entertainment for the afternoon. Before you leave, tumble at an indoor playground for adults. Admission costs 60 to 90 yuan, and the exhibition runs till March 28th. Suzuki ICS for CGTN, Shanghai.
Well, that certainly brings back some memories from the 90s. A quick run through commodity prices for you. So let's start with Brent crude. It does continue its Q4 rally. It's actually gone up by over 20% since the start of October. Today, no different. Brent futures due in February up by nearly 0.6% at 16.26 GMT. Vaccine-fueled optimism, it seems, is also driving other commodities higher. Copper futures just shy of 15% higher so far this year. In Q4. Copper forwards in London up 22.7%. In other news across the continent, judges in Italy were presiding over a massive corruption case involving Eni and Royal Dutch Shell and the joint purchase of drilling rights in Nigeria are expected to deliver their ruling on that case at the end of the first quarter of 2021. Here's what's coming up next. We'll take a closer look at how the shea butter industry is impacting lives and livelihoods in West Africa.
You don't find the stories of North Africa by sitting on the sidelines. No one else will take you where we can in North Africa. And no one else will show you what it's all about. CGTN, see the difference.
Welcome back. Shea butter has long been considered to be almost sacred by many in West Africa because of its countless health benefits. But now an increase in global demand for shea butter is providing an opportunity for communities across Africa. Roughly 16 million people in Africa, especially women living in rural areas, are supported by this one plant. This is their story.
This is shea butter, a pure creamy goodness which has been protecting women's skin for generations. It's also a daily staple for cooking in West Africa. To extract shea butter, this nut has to go through a 15-step process. So how does this turn into this? We journeyed to northern Ghana to solve this nutritious mystery.
Nama chance kurma ba ya parnam bazani ni la kihma kale kat dwam nanama ka dwat za pale de so kihma be dwat ma pale kat te za pilgo le tumna den non shama kart nan bandirgo ba to ye Mala yung so point. Tel people besoin yung ti nubala. Yo sama ra afana ra kati dama tan shiya shɛli ŋɔ maa zaa di daa nyɛla taansi ka ti pihira tin pihiri maa din ka ti ma nim daa mali lihiri ti n dari ʒɛri n dari yɛli kam n lihiri ti hali ka ti ti n paai ti gba saɣi ʒishee bɔbu nyɛla zaɣ suŋ n zaŋ tima nima ni ya ŋɔ zaa dama tin ʒiya ŋɔ zuŋɔ zaa ha kpe maa kpalim gbubi ti ka ti ʒiya maa ti niŋla viɛnyɛla titi suhupiɛlli pam ka di niŋ titi dama tuuntuuni ka di niŋ afaani pam maa suhupiɛlli nyɛla asani ai ti sura ka paɣiri paɣibu ka dira mari saha di maa n ti bukaata n bala mala laɣasi dibata a kpeerim bɛla wolibu sani dama tii nyɛla din woli ninvuɣu yino n tooi pihi kpalinsi ata dibanahi di bɛla sokam ni o tuma sani ti yɛn waali mi n kɔrigi tin kamani tin tiŋli shɛm ŋɔ maa n zaŋ kpe duu n ti diɛli dundɔŋ ni n ti diɛli ka di wɔŋ di yɛn wɔŋ mi ka ti zaŋ dɔɣu niŋ dini n bu n vali n yina n ti yɛli n zaŋ kpe n ti diɛli ka di kuui ka a yɛn ja ka a zaŋ niŋ toli ni n ja a mii ka yaa a yɛn ʒila tiŋa n piiri zaɣ yinyin n tora n ka di jɛra ka di ja ka a zaŋ ti niŋ duɣu ni n chim n naan ʒiri chaŋ ma neega n ti nɛm wahala ka ti dira dama bin ni nya afaani ka a zaŋ ti ti so mari nyaŋa mi ka a zaŋ ti ti so maa dama ti gba bin yɛn ʒiya ka tumdi tuu shɛli maa di bɛ ti gba sani ma ti gba tooi tum di mi ni kani maa ti zaŋ mi ti tiba ka niŋ ni wahala niŋdi bindira bi yɛla yi kana dini n yɛli dini ka bi yɛn zaŋ ni di zuɣu n puhiri suŋ bɛ paɣaba maa sani viɛnyɛla bɛ paɣaba maa sani bi gbubi viɛnyɛlinga n gba gbubi bi yiranim maa ni bihi maa ka bi ti niŋ ba afaani dahin shɛli
I'm Zakaria Adam Lasira. I work with Yumza Women's Association. We are basically into shea butter production. We use shea nuts to produce it into shea butter. We have about 225 women who are into the production. So what we do is immediately you come in and you are given the shea nuts, you are supposed to pick out all bad nuts. Then after picking out the bad nuts, you then roast, where we have roasters and some of the women are even roasting. After this stage, you send it into the milling room for milling. Then it is being milled into a paste form. Then after milling, you go into kneading. We produce handcrafted butter. After kneading, you get your fat in motion, then you send it back to your stoves to boil, where you now separate the oil from the waste. After the boiling, you are supposed to filter. After this stage, we stir it till it solidifies. And after solidification, we package it into containers the buyers prefer. to stay in communities like this is very difficult, where women are left to struggle on their own. So coming up as a growing child, it wasn't easy for me. When I first came to this community, most of the women, the children in the community weren't going to school because normally men say it's not important for one to educate a girl child. But after the women joining the group, they saw that it's very necessary for them to send all their girl children to school. So currently, I'll say this particular group have helped a lot of women, and all the girl child in the community are all back to school. So I'll say what I was looking for, I have achieved part of it.
It is estimated that over 90% of share goes into the confectionery and bakery industry. So within this industry, share is used mainly for formulation purposes in improving the quality of formulations. In Europe, for instance, where regulations allow, share is used as a cocoa butter equivalent for chocolate and is believed to increase the shelf life and also the formulation quality. 10% of the remaining goes into the cosmetic industry. So in the cosmetic industry, shea is favored for its high moisturizing quality as well as its anti-aging and anti-inflammatory qualities, which mainly is used in the personal care industry for body lotions, soaps, and other purposes, but mainly for the personal care industry.
Quick run through the currencies as we wrap up the hour for you. So the rand does continue to have a pretty strong fourth quarter. It's clawed back at least 13% of value against the US dollar since the start of October. At 1468.01, it's back to levels that we saw around 10 months ago, just as the country was in the very, very early stages of the COVID-19 pandemic. On the crypto side, as we mentioned earlier, after teasing the $20,000 barrier for some weeks, Bitcoin just continues to smash through records. 10.77% higher at 1616 GMT, $23,489 at that point. At those levels, the cryptocurrency's value has gone up by over 225% just in 2020. So impressive numbers. That's it for this edition of Global Business Africa. As always, we'd like to hear your thoughts on the content you've seen on the program in the last hour. There are many ways to get your thoughts back to us, all of them on your screens right now. I'm Ramah Nyang in the Kenyan capital, Nairobi. Thank you for your company in the last hour. The World Today is up next from Washington, D.C.